This story goes back to 2018. That year, journalist Annabelle Symington published a sensational investigation into fraud in Nepal's tourism industry. The investigation focuses on companies that organize hiking expeditions in the Himalayas, including treks to Everest Base Camp. Virtually all tourists who take part in these trips are insured, and usually with expensive policies that include helicopter evacuation. After all, these are mountains, with high altitude and a significant risk of altitude sickness, so tourists generally don't cut corners on insurance. Journalist Symington proved that some of these tour operators and helicopter companies are involved in a complex fraud scheme. Hiking in the Himalayas is not the easiest activity, but treks to Everest Base Camp or around Annapurna are often done by people who are not always well prepared. You'll find retirees there, people in poor physical shape, or simply those who aren't ready for the mountains. But let's clarify what this trek actually is. This is important. It is not a climb to the summit. These people are not going to extreme altitudes. They don't need ropes, crampons, ice axes, and so on. They don't cross glaciers. They're not exposed to avalanches. They don't fall into crevasses. And overall, they travel along fairly comfortable trails. So, starting from lower elevations, they gradually make their way up to Everest Base Camp, which sits at an altitude of 5,364 meters. This is still a physically demanding adventure, but it is not mountaineering. You walk along scenic trails, stay overnight in lodges, eat in small cafes, and overall, it's a fairly comfortable experience. Most importantly, it is thousands of times safer than climbing Everest itself, and it is far more accessible. Permits to climb the summit of Everest cost more than $10,000, and the climb itself requires months of training, preparation, and significant mountaineering experience. None of that is required for the trek. It is much more affordable. There are no such permits, and essentially anyone can join. Retirees go, people who are overweight go, and some even bring their children. In short, anyone who wants to can take part in this trek. However, since the altitude is still significant and the route ends above 5,000 meters, there is a risk of altitude sickness. Due to the lack of oxygen in the air, it can cause brain swelling, fluid buildup in the lungs, and other complications, potentially even resulting in death. The best and most effective treatment for altitude sickness is to descend as quickly as possible. That is exactly why most tourists purchase insurance that includes helicopter evacuation. You get into a helicopter, you are taken down to lower elevations, and you live happily ever after. And an important point, some Nepali companies insist that tourists have this kind of insurance. Otherwise, guides simply will not take you. And indeed, even on a trek to Everest Base Camp, some unprepared people experience episodes of altitude sickness. Moreover, many of them, unlike experienced climbers, neglect proper acclimatization. Their vacation time is limited, and they cannot afford to spend 2 weeks waiting for their bodies to adjust to the altitude. As a result, many of them are actually evacuated from the trek by helicopter. And this is not particularly difficult to arrange. Above base camp, helicopters have a much harder time operating. At altitudes of 6,000 to 7,000 meters, not every pilot is willing to fly. But from elevations of around 4,000, even up to 4,500 meters, professional pilots in modern helicopters can transport tourists to a hospital in Kathmandu almost like an air taxi. But let's return to the 2018 investigation, when people first started talking about this scheme. At first, it wasn't nearly as dramatic. Sherpas would simply suggest calling a helicopter for tired tourists. After all, the insurance company would pay for it anyway. In other words, if you set out on a trek and at some altitude you get tired or disappointed with the whole idea, you're left with two options: push through and keep going, or spend the next several days making your way back down. And most likely, you would have to pay for a personal Sherpa to accompany you. Treks are done in groups, and naturally, the guide is not going to abandon everyone else just to escort one exhausted traveler back down for free. So, as you can see, leaving the route is both difficult and expensive. But then a perfect solution appears. Your insurance covers a helicopter, and within a couple of hours, you could be sipping a Coca-Cola somewhere in Kathmandu. There's just one problem. Fatigue and disappointment in the mountains are not considered an insured event. Helicopter rescue typically requires a genuine threat to life. Only then will the insurance cover it. But then the Sherpa says to you, "Sir, ma'am, I can see you're exhausted. Let's call a helicopter. I'll take care of everything." I know a pilot who, just like me, will confirm that your life was in danger. And a doctor at a hospital in Kathmandu is also in on it. He'll write a report saying you were miraculously saved from altitude sickness. And with that kind of documentation, any insurance company will issue a very large payout. And as you can imagine, convincing a tourist who is struggling to breathe at an altitude of 4,000 meters is not particularly difficult. Especially if the Sherpa applies a bit of pressure and says that it will only get harder from here. Why suffer? When in just a couple of hours, you could be in Kathmandu. According to reports from 2018, the scheme involved tour operators and guides, helicopter transport companies, and even some private hospitals. All the participants, the tour company, the guide, the pilot, and even the hospital allegedly received kickbacks from the insurance payouts. This was because insurance companies were not simply covering the cost of rescue operations, but paying for them at a special rate, an inflated rate. Sometimes inflated by dozens of times. That difference was then split among the guides, helicopter pilots, doctors, and everyone involved in these so-called rescue missions. As insurance companies continued to pay out enormous sums, the scheme only became more widespread. This was not an isolated incident. It was a system. Dozens of tour companies across Nepal were using it, and with each passing year, more and more guides were persuading their clients to call for a helicopter, even when it wasn't necessary. Journalist Annabelle Symington herself signed up for one of these treks as a client and conducted her investigation on the ground. She also made the journey to Everest Base Camp, where she met a woman waiting for a helicopter evacuation that she clearly did not need. Annabelle notes that this scheme involves almost everyone organizing treks in the Himalayas. They treat it as something completely normal and, apparently, don't even bother to hide it, having run it for years. Her report, along with coverage in Nepali media, led to a government investigation. And it would seem that this should have resolved the problem, but it didn't. By many accounts, Nepal in 2018 was a fairly corrupt country, and the government's response was essentially, "Well, that's not good insurance fraud, don't do it again." There were no arrests, no real punishments, and no meaningful measures taken, even though schemes involving hundreds of thousands of dollars had been uncovered. Incidentally, this was also when stories first emerged about tourists being given baking soda and laxatives, but no one paid much attention to them. No one was imprisoned, and overall there was no significant public response to the issue. It's reasonable to assume that officials may not have shut it down without reason, and may themselves have been receiving kickbacks from the scheme. In general, holding Sherpas accountable is quite difficult. They have strong unions and, overall, significant influence in the country. For example, when it was revealed that some Sherpas were falsifying summit ascents, confirming that a climber had reached the top when they had not, they were fined. Attention, €40. And that was it. In 2013, nearly 100 Sherpas attacked climbers Simone Moro and Ueli Steck, allegedly over the use of fixed ropes. It turned into a massive fight, with foreign climbers beaten and forced to flee. What punishment did the Sherpas receive? That's right, none. And so, the insurance and helicopter scam continued to thrive as if nothing had happened. Its exposure seemed to have no real impact at all. Sherpas continued flying tourists out by helicopter just as before. The head of the Central Investigation Bureau, Major Kumar, commented on it this way. The fraud continued due to weak enforcement and lack of real consequences. When some international insurance companies threatened to stop operating in Nepal, the authorities effectively staged an imitation of an investigation one that led nowhere. But in September 2025, what some called a Gen Z revolution took place in Nepal. The government had been tightening control, corruption was growing, and people seemed to tolerate it. But when the authorities decided to impose strict control over social media platforms like TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, and others, framing it as digital sovereignty, that was the breaking point, and people took to the streets. And it was mostly young people, those who had grown up in the era of the internet and access to information. They no longer remembered the earlier times in Nepal, when the country was ruled by a king and powerful families, and decisions were not meant to be questioned. The monarchy in Nepal ended in 2008, and since then, a new generation has grown up, one with far more open views on life. It was they who became the driving force behind what was called the Gen Z revolution. What followed was a violent crackdown on protesters, including the use of live ammunition, dozens of deaths, clashes with police, and government buildings set on fire. In short revolution. As a result, part of the government resigned. The prime minister stepped down, and the government lifted the social media ban. But the unrest continued, evolving into demands for action against corruption and the corrupt elite. And as you can understand, during these events, the country's government changed significantly. Recently, a 35-year-old former rapper, Balendra Shah, became prime minister. His party gained a majority in parliament and effectively ended the rule of Nepal's three largest parties, which had dominated the country for the past 20 years, rotating power among themselves. And if you think this has nothing to do with mountaineering, you would be wrong. First, mountaineering is one of Nepal's main sources of income, and much of the country depends on it. Second, Mingma David Sherpa, a Nepali climber who has summited Everest 9 times, also became a member of parliament. They have already proposed reforms aimed at reducing the number of deaths in the mountains. One of the proposed rules is that only climbers who have already summited at least one peak above 7,000 meters will be allowed to attempt 8,000ers. If this rule is implemented, it could significantly reduce the number of commercial climbers and so-called Instagram climbers, people with little or no mountaineering experience who still buy Everest expeditions. It is exactly these climbers who most often cause traffic jams on the Hillary Step, require rescue operations, and sometimes lose their lives in the mountains. It may significantly reduce their numbers, but beyond that, the new government has also focused on fighting corruption and has revived the 2018 insurance case. At the end of 2025, Nepal's Central Investigation Bureau, or CAB, announced the reopening of an investigation into allegations of fraud. Then, in January of this year, they arrested 6 people from the trekking and mountain rescue industry, accusing them of continuing fraudulent practices. And in March, the CAB released details of its latest investigation. That is why this topic is currently in the spotlight. And if you look at the media coverage, you might get the impression of a climber making his way up the Hillary step toward the summit, while a Sherpa behind him is smirking after having poisoned his porridge in the morning. The poisoned climber clutches his stomach and is then evacuated by helicopter. But in reality, the story is somewhat different. All confirmed cases of fraud 171 incidents over 3 years were related to trekking in the Himalayas, not high-altitude mountaineering. These were tourists trekking to Everest Base Camp, trekking to Annapurna, and through other valleys of Nepal. And this is actually a very important point. I would say a critically important one. Tourists who go on Everest Base Camp treks are not climbers. And their guides, although they also belong to the Sherpa ethnic group, are very different from those who climb 8,000ers. They are more like trekking guides with walking sticks than high-altitude mountaineers. So, what we have in the case files, which span 1,243 pages. We read that over the past 3 years, 4,782 foreign patients were treated in Nepal. Out of these, 171 were allegedly involved in this scheme. That is 3.5% of all patients. The KAB also examined helicopter flights from 3 transport companies and found that out of 2,320 flights, 317 were fraudulent. That is 13.5% of all rescue flights. But the main point of the scam was not simply calling a helicopter. It was inflating the cost of the services. They marked up prices sometimes by dozens of times. For example, in one case, 4 tourists were rescued in a single helicopter flight, but the company billed the insurance for 4 separate flights totaling $31,000. And even that was not enough. A private flight from Lukla to Kathmandu costs $2,500. So transporting 4 tourists separately would come to around $10,000. Yet they charged $31,000, and that is only the helicopter portion. Inflated bills were also issued by guides, doctors, and everyone involved in the so-called rescue operation. So the total sums were very substantial. According to some estimates, over the past 3 years, the total amount moved through these schemes may exceed $20 million. Although, clearly, this scheme has existed for much longer. There were reports about it as early as 2016. I remember reading such news, but at the time, no one paid much attention to it. So, most likely, we are only seeing the tip of the iceberg. The true amount of money allegedly stolen from insurance companies can only be guessed at. An Australian tourist told journalists that 10 people from her group took a single helicopter flight to a hospital in Kathmandu. But the guides instructed each of them to say that they had flown separately on individual flights. She believes that the company Himalayan Social Journey billed insurance providers for each client individually and ultimately made $35,000 or possibly more. Another tourist told the Kathmandu Post that her partner complained of a mild headache, and the guide immediately suggested a helicopter evacuation, saying they should all fly together as a sick person could not be left unattended. They were told that if anyone asked, they should say they were feeling very unwell. After descending from the mountains, the climbers are taken to hospitals, where they undergo numerous tests, examinations, and completely unnecessary procedures. All of this is billed to insurance companies at inflated rates. In total, according to the Kathmandu Post, the investigation covered 10 helicopter companies, 6 hospitals, and 36 trekking and rescue agencies. So how did interaction with tourists actually work? I would highlight three main scenarios. The first and most common one. Sherpas would simply persuade tired tourists to call a rescue helicopter when they didn't actually need one. And this was the most common scenario. The second method. Sherpas would neglect proper acclimatization and push tourists too quickly to higher altitudes, which caused them to actually develop altitude sickness. But if neither of these two approaches worked, they would resort to soda, which they would secretly add to tourists' food. After eating it, a person would quickly start experiencing discomfort, nausea, stomach pain, and so on. Then the guide would say, "Oh, my friend, this is altitude sickness. You may be in serious danger. We need to call a helicopter immediately." Of course, this last scenario is the most dramatic one, and it is the one that the media focused on. However, in the investigators' reports, I found only one such case, where soda was allegedly added to a tourist's food. Obviously, this is difficult to prove, but it seems to me that most cases were actually based on persuading tourists and applying pressure from guides. An important point. Media reports often create the impression that this involved high-altitude climbers, Sherpas, guiding people to the summit of Everest. And that immediately raised some doubts for me. Everest Base Camp is a relatively compact place, with only a few hundred people there at any given time. And these are often the same foreign climbers and guides who have been working there for years, leading clients season after season. They are assisted by high-altitude Sherpas, who are themselves professional mountaineers. They are in very close contact with foreigners, year after year, and if someone were to start secretly putting soda into people's food, it would most likely come to light very quickly. In general, high-altitude Sherpas have no real incentive to poison climbers. They already earn very good money. Moreover, they hold licenses from the Nepal National Mountain Guides Association, which they value highly. Everest Base Camp is a profitable place, and access there is not easy. And if someone started poisoning people there, the culprit would be identified fairly quickly and stripped of their license. That would be a serious financial blow, especially if climbers stopped buying expensive permits for Everest and other peaks. Also, climbers like Simone Moro, Denis Urubko, and Nirmal Purja often spend the entire season at Everest Base Camp. These are not naive tourists who can easily be misled. In short, in the case files, there is not a single episode related to high-altitude climbing or even Everest Base Camp itself. The affected tourists were those trekking to Everest Base Camp, trekking to Annapurna, Manaslu, the Langtang Valley, and other valleys of Nepal. And this makes sense. Everest Base Camp hosts only a few hundred people during the season, but trekking in the mountains attracts hundreds of thousands of tourists. That is where the scale is. And as I already mentioned, Sherpas in these cases are more like tour guides. They don't necessarily need special licenses, and if they lose a job, they can easily get hired by another company. In other words, the risks are relatively low, and many of the tourists themselves, especially those without mountaineering experience, are not high-altitude climbers. Serious climbers, on the other hand, carefully monitor their health and physical condition, follow training programs, and have obligations to sponsors. For them, Everest is a major objective, and if something goes wrong, they will investigate it thoroughly. Incidentally, many climbers prepare their own meals, so secretly adding soda to their food would be quite difficult. So the sensational headlines like "Sherpas poison climbers" are both true and not true at the same time. This is Everest, but not quite Everest. These are Sherpas, but not the same kind. These are climbers, but more like tourists. As I mentioned earlier, no confirmed cases of fraud have been found above Everest Base Camp. And that would also be unprofitable, because helicopter rescue operations above Everest Base Camp at altitudes of 6,000, 7,000 meters, and even above 5,000 meters are extremely dangerous. Flying helicopters at those altitudes is already a very risky operation. Such a scheme could easily cost pilots their lives. They are unlikely to take that risk. At the moment, 33 people are involved in the case, 10 of whom have already been arrested. There are reports that many of the suspects have already left the country. According to the case files, the amount defrauded from insurance companies is close to $20 million. Although, in my opinion, this is only the tip of the iceberg. The number of affected people has reached 5,000. Nepal's Ministry of Tourism has required helicopter companies, tour operators, and hospitals to submit all invoices related to rescue operations to a new government committee. The Guardian reports that action has been taken against 15 Nepali companies accused of carrying out unnecessary evacuations or hospitalizations. And in the coming months, several more cases will be investigated. Clearly, this has been going on for decades, not just in the last few years. So I think we will still learn a lot more interesting details. And of course, the headlines are very striking. Climbers are being poisoned on Everest. But as I said, I found only one case in the investigation involving soda being added to a tourist's food. It is possible, of course, that there were many more, and that it was a common practice among these fraudsters. But proving such poisoning is practically impossible. And as I mentioned, this is more about tourists than about climbers. Are high-altitude Sherpas involved in this scheme? Could they be poisoning real climbers attempting 8,000ers on Everest? Theoretically, they could. I can believe that high-altitude Sherpas might engage in insurance fraud by calling a helicopter when it is not truly necessary. But adding something to climbers' food seems, in my view, too noticeable and too risky for them. It is hard to believe they would do that. As I said, no cases of fraud have been identified above Everest Base Camp or in the higher camps on Everest in general. So this is mostly about trekking. What will be the consequences of this story for Nepal? First of all, it will certainly hit tourism. Many people will choose other destinations, at least for a while. But most importantly, it will affect insurance prices. Many insurance companies will leave Nepal, and those that remain will raise their prices so much that climbers, tourists, and anyone who wants to insure their life in the country will definitely feel the difference. As a result, climbing Everest and traveling to Nepal in general with insurance will become significantly more expensive. These are the latest updates. We'll be watching how this all unfolds. It's a very interesting story. We are being promised further developments and new case materials, so there may be more episodes on this topic. So make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss them. Like the video and leave a comment with your thoughts on this story.